Okay, welcome to the latest episode of Data in the Hallway. My name is Ray Pake, Community Manager at PingCAP, and joined by my co-host, now back in the Netherlands, Daniel. Daniel, good to see you. Uh,
Hello, good to see you
yep,
again.
right, sunshine in Northern Europe, and we're lucky to have as a repeat guest, Sam Dillard. I think you were on maybe about a year ago, so it's always good to have people come back. It means that we didn't scare people off the first time. I think your role has slightly changed over the past year. You were like one of the product leads last year. Now you're one of the architects. I think you're spending a lot more time with customers and getting on planes. So it's good to have you. Glad that we were able to catch you between your trips. So
Yeah. Yeah. So happy to be
cool.
back. Thanks.
Yeah,
It's
thanks.
been a long time.
Yeah, cool. All right, so the title of today's episode is What Happens as We Scale. And I just want to sort of address this like before we get started. So obviously we're going to talk about scalability and people may potentially roll their eyes like, isn't this topic already well known? And, why do we need another discussion on scalability? I'm going to sort of ask the question that I asked you, Sam, when you first talked to me about this. Like, why do we want to talk about scalability today? When it feels like it's been discussed, for decades, right? So,
Yeah. I it's true that scalability is beaten to death as a term and also seems fairly obvious what it means and what the point is. I think the reason why I like to talk about this and like to talk, when I'm talking to customers, getting them to sort of think more precisely about what scalability is well, at least this initiative of mine sort of came from talking to customers and also just walking through conferences and seeing the term everywhere on the backs of booths and things like that, and knowing in some cases what some of those vendors mean by that, and it's not really what they're saying. Granted, all marketing is a little bit abstract on purpose and by design, and we accept that, but the term scalability means so much more than just like more of what you're doing now, right? It means, well, when you're talking about systems, it's it's not just the like how do you deal with increased volume of data or volume of customers or users or something like that. There's that, but there's ways to think about it that are important, and then there's all of the stuff that comes downstream of that too. And what I see happen is people have a kind of an abstract concept of scalability. They have the sort of I call these dimensions of scalability. There's tons of ways you can scale or not scale, and they find systems that scale fairly well, in the dimensions that everyone knows about. And then when they've implemented or they're running through evaluations, but worse, if they've implemented and they've gotten really far with the system, they realize that like operations that they were doing prior, the experiences that they were having downstream of the system are completely different. And they've scaled the system, but they've just sort of deferred the problem to something else. And so the goal of what I want to talk about today is kind of like how to think about scalability so that you're not deferring the problem to something else, and um, truly holistically thinking about scalability and all of the inputs to that.
right, right. Yeah, I think it's one of those like nebulous terms. I don't want to say overused because it's a real challenge. It's a real problem, but I think like depending on the context, it's really confusing as to what people really mean by scalability. It depends on context. It depends on whether you're talking about software, like managing users, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, it's one of those terms. Like sometimes it's good to ask like a clarifying question if you're talking to a vendor, if you're talking to like a partner, like in one context you're using the terminology or even what they were talking about, right? So yeah, I think that's a fair point. So when you talk to like customers or even partners, like uh, what do you typically mean, like when you say like scalability, sorry, when it comes to databases? So,
Yeah, well, I think maybe I'll start with an analogy kind of. If you can imagine, say someone like Taylor Swift, who when she was, I think, 14 or 15, was playing at local bars, then had her parents bring her to Nashville, and she would play again local bars, but small bars, not the Broadway bars. And she got popular from that kind of thing. But the scale of that event, right, of those things is basically like come to the bar and there'll be music and you can just kind of turn your head and look at it, right? Nothing changes about the bar, or about the venue. But at the scale of like her Eras tour, most recently, it's not just about how do you support 100,000 people, right? It's about how do you support 100,000 people and their parking and their Ubers and Lyfts and the lines for the concession stands and the flow of traffic so that you're not a fire hazard and all of these things that are actually enormously complicated. The number of potential problem areas grows as you scale up, right? And so as you scale up a database system, this is the context that we're talking about more officially. The scaling up a database system is not just about having more writes and reads and more connections and more users, if you want to think more business terms oriented, or just more data volume stored. It's about having all of that and having the experience not change as you scale. So the North Star of scalability for me, the thing to point to, and no system achieves this perfectly and probably ever will. I think it might be impossible, but the thing to point at is that when your system scales, a truly scalable system, as it scales, the the experience doesn't change, right? The only thing that changes is the amount of the system that you deploy. So the only thing that ought to change in the North Star of scalability is your infrastructure size and your costs. So it's something you have complete control over. That's the goal. Truly scalable systems are something if I have the need, I can just throw a predictable amount of money at the problem and it'll just go away, right? That's basically the point. And um, the way I see experience changing is there's a couple ways to think about this. One is um, if the dimension, the thing that you're trying to scale is a volume of something, like if it's the number of requests to the database, to the data system, or if it's the number of users or the number of connections, does that metric scale proportionally with the incremental size scale of your system? So if you add a node, if you add a fifth node of 4 nodes, does the system scale to like a fifth node, right? What would a fifth node ought to scale to linearly? And then does it continue to do that unbounded? That's a truly scalable system. So you want to see, if you're looking at volumes, if you can imagine a graph where you have like node count on the x-axis and um, you have some volume of something on the y-axis. Does that line look linear, right? Is that an up and to the right kind of 1-to-1 ratio of some kind? Um, on the flip side, if you have things like durations, things like the time a request takes to complete, or the time it takes to do to add an index, to change the schema of the data, or reformat it in some way, that same graph, as you scale, that duration ought to be flat, right? You don't want to that a truly scalable system is that whatever you're doing today, if you make sure that that same thing is happening, but your data increases or the nodes increase or however you're scaling, um, that the experience doesn't change. So you're not increasing latency, you're not taking longer to do DDL operations. You don't have to take anything offline, right? You don't have to make any sacrifices. So if you scale something up, does everything else hold? Can you still do the backups and restores that you were doing, all that stuff? So there's tons of dimensions. I call these dimensions of scalability, or we call them that. All of those things are incredibly important, and they can be bottlenecks, and often are bottlenecks when people do change systems to something that was purported to scale.
Yeah. No, so you actually like it preempted my questions. Like, what are some of the early warning signs that you might be having scalability changes down the road? And I think you put it succinctly is basically the level of experience, right? That shouldn't change. Like, you shouldn't wait longer for queries to complete, more users to get added, or more users are able to use a system. So those are some of the like early warning signs. Um, so when you first deploy a system, I mean, you have limited number of users. Like, how do you like attest for this? Like in the early days, I think in most cases you're not going to experience these problems because I mean, your early stages of your career, you're a musician, you're only going to have 50 people show up at the bar, if that, right? But how do I even test for 20,000 people showing up at the stadium for to watch you perform? Like it is, what are some of the things that you can do to sort of predict, like, am I purchasing a system or am I building a solution that's going to be able to handle as I grow?
I mean, it's a
Yeah.
great question, and it's hard to answer in a lot of ways, and I think that's that. So what I won't probably go through here is I am well, I guess me and my team are working on a framework for doing that exactly. So to considering these dimensions and then figuring out a way to measure them. I think realistically that this framework is like it's in itself a North Star. It's like if you have infinite time on your hands, then you can measure all these things, right? And you can predict all these things, but no one has that. So like the very beginning of the continuum of how much work you would do is just to consider those dimensions at all. Have a reference to having these dimensions. So when you're at the point where you're low scale requirements, you're operating on one monolithic database. For instance, if you're in transactional mode, this is more relevant here, but if you have one MySQL or one Postgres, one MS SQL node that you vertically scaled, you're fine for now, but you want to consider all of these dimensions for the next thing you do, right? And by all means, don't consider them right away, because when you're a startup, you want to just get things out the door. But when you do scale, you want to make sure that you have all of these things in your mind, and at least be able to pick from that list what's important to you, what you figure your business is going to need. You're not going to need everything. You might have a business that never does schema changes. I have no idea, right? But these are all things that you should consider. Um, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago when data, people have always talked about how data has been burgeoning, right? Data has gotten is bigger than it ever was. Um, but people have been basically sharding, right? They've been scaling out by just adding nodes that kind of are independent nodes for decades now, at least 2 decades, and it's kind of like a settled science now. That does scale essentially infinitely. I mean, you can ask Meta, right, about how many MySQL nodes they have in a single sharded cluster, but the it doesn't truly scale, right, in the way that I defined it earlier, in the sense that as you're sharding that out, you're massively increasing the complexity of the infrastructure and the cognitive load and the number of people you need to manage it, which is all fair, right? It's not they didn't do anything wrong, but these are all things that are technically not scaling, right? You're adding something else besides cost and infrastructure. You're adding brains and you're adding time, and in fact, when you are increasing the number of nodes that you have that are independently operating, such that you need to manage logic on top of them, like you need to manage in some way acid compliance sometimes across them, depending on what the operation is, or um, just the routing of the data with the sharding, right? Like how you're sharding and the sharding logic. If you have to add an index, right? If you're a system that needs an index, if you have to add an index or do backups or whatever, or change the way you do backups, that request from your stakeholders, if you're on the data infra side, is an enormous request, right? It's just, a product manager in the front end of whatever application you're supporting might say like, hey, we have this new feature on the roadmap where it's like in this sprint, right? Um, they come to the data infrastructure team and they say, to do this, we need to add this field or we need to add this index to speed up these queries. The data infra team is a bottleneck for the front end team, right? They're going to say, Oh, okay, great. But now that they've sharded, this is a roadmap item, right? The data infra now has a roadmap item. They have to reprioritize. They have to spend time. Their product manager has to prioritize that this new operation may take 4 months, right? And maybe downtime or some other sacrifice they have to make. And so there goes that sprint, right? Like that front end team no longer can put that in that sprint. They have to back burner it. And that slows down businesses like enormously. So a truly scalable system prevents that kind of thing from happening. And that's why you want to consider all those possibilities.
Yeah, I think another part there that also plays a role is that scalability for like seasonal workloads is something that people often don't really consider because like people are focused on scaling up, but then forget about scaling down.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to take the example of Taylor Swift again, not that I'm a like, huge fan or anything, my partner is, but um, well, I think it was Ticketmaster that just had that embarrassing flub, right, where it was down for a long time while millions of people were trying to buy Taylor Swift tickets. That's a scale problem, right? And like you can't just reshard and reshard on the front end and back end of that. I mean, I guess you could, but it requires an enormous amount of planning. You have to have a big heads up. So yeah, a truly scalable system should also be able to adapt, right? And like be scalable quickly. So part of another dimension of scalability is how quickly does it scale? What is the operational complexity of doing the scale up and down? So that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think another thing where Taylor Swift might be a good example is that if you have a sharded system, not all the shards have the same size. So if you're Spotify or something similar, then your Taylor Swift shard might be a little bit more busy. So that adds some efficiency issues.
Totally, yeah. I mean, and that's kind of related to schema, right? Like if your schema is built in such a way where now you have a lot of people trying to view data about a single celebrity where that celebrity might have like a unique ID or something, then you might have to make a schema change because this celebrity is going to take down your system, right? And so all of that is part of it. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really hard thing to balance because, like, trying to balance complexity and trying to sort of maintain the system of whatever you chose, like or whatever you built. Because I mean, you're not going to have zero complexity. If somebody tells me that, I know that person's not telling me the truth. But but on the other hand, if like you're saying, if it's overly complex and you have to just throw more people and resources at it, then that's probably not a good sign either, right? So it's a really tough thing to balance. So if you were like building a system like we're building a database system at PingCAP or in the TiDB community, or if you're choosing or data system or data product, how do you sort of evaluate systems that are somewhat like a future proof so that you don't if you have to deal with scalability issues, you're not going to have zero complexity, but it's a little bit more elegant, right? At least, and you don't have to like continuously like throw dollars and people at it. Like how do you, I mean, future proof is another term that's sort of overly used, but how do we build or choose a system that's going to support your scalability needs in the future?
Yeah, I mean, future
And
proof is definitely a commonly used term, but like, I mean, it resonates for a good reason. Guide against or protect against the future. So whatever the future may hold, you want to be ready for it. The easiest thing to do is to kind of harking back to the dimensions of scalability. Just consider them and consider like think about your business, think about what you may need to do, and then if you're it depends on your evaluation time window, right? And how many systems you have to evaluate. And there's a lot of inputs to that. If you have limited time, so there's a spectrum of like how much effort you can put into an evaluation of a scalable system. At the very bottom end of the effort continuum, I would say consider the possible things that you're going to do. What does experience mean to you? Consider performance and the number of operations of things. What will change over time, and like what operations will we be doing on the database and stuff like that. All of those things become your dimensions that you want to then research. Like use their sales team if you need to, or their sales engineering solutions architects. Maybe get access to their engineers if you can. But definitely look at their documentation, read blogs, like find out how this system deals with all of those dimensions. So this is just conceptual. It's just like reading about the design. Like has this system considered this case, right? And if not, like can I get an answer from them at some point? Just make sure that those bases are covered. You don't necessarily need to test all of these things because, first of all, scale testing is an incredibly expensive endeavor. So I would never want you to follow a framework that like requires you to spend $100,000 per system you're evaluating or more. So that's kind of where I would start, right? And I think it's kind of obvious, but I think just hearing someone kind of decree it or mandate it almost helps, because it's like, oh, I'm not going insane by reading through all this documentation. It truly is that complicated of a problem, and I should be paying that much attention to it. Further down the effort continuum is actually doing the tests for some of these things that you really want to verify. Maybe the vendor that you're looking at, or if it's truly a fully open source, maybe there's like community stuff that talks about tests they've done. And you can use that. But if you want to run your own tests and be absolutely sure, you want to scale scale the dimension you're going to scale on. If you expect new users, what does that mean? Does that mean new schema objects? Does that mean more connections? Does that mean just more requests? Sorry, hold on. I was like coming down from a cough.
No worries.
So sorry if I look weird doing that. The you want to identify where to test and hold kind of everything constant and watch that one thing scale the system as you need to, right? So if you're going to just increase the number of requests made, scale the nodes according to whatever you think the scale ought to be, and watch how that scales. So see if it's connections or if it's throughput, watch the line, see linear. Mm-hmm. And there's a framework we can use that actually has like a line of best fit, like a line that you want to find. Then you take a bunch of snapshots of you take a data point, like this scale, this scale, this scale, and then try to find lines of best fit. And so if you evaluate 5, 10 systems, find the line of best fit so that that system wins in that category if it fits best on the linear line. And you do that on every dimension you want. And you can do it for the flat ones too, the durations. And you just kind of go through those motions. And there's math you can do. We can document that for you, but that's obviously high amount of effort and high cost of evaluation, but that is like where on the continuum, that is the higher effort version. If you have the time and you have the bandwidth and you really, really, really want to make sure and be confident that you're future proof, that's the direction I would go.
Cool. No, that makes perfect sense. So, I mean, if I were to sort of summarize like important things, I mean, obviously you need to do your homework, figure out what you're using your term, Sam, here, like using what your key dimensions are for your situation, and then test against those dimensions as much as you can. And yeah, so hopefully they'll give you a sense of security in terms of, yeah, I'm somewhat confident that if I run into this sort of scenario, like the solutions that I'm building or that I'm choosing to purchase or use is going to be to handle the additional load or scalability as you continue to grow. So that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I mean, I think this is why, like, when you're evaluating like vendors or system, it takes a long time. Like, you can't just, you're not buying an app on your app store on your phone. Unfortunately, you're going to have to do quite a bit of work, sometimes months, if not longer, work to to evaluate where you what you're trying to like a purchase or build. So, cool.
Yeah, very true.
Daniel, any other questions from you or like,
And no questions for me.
yeah, cool. Yeah, I think I covered all the questions I had, and I know, like you mentioned, like documentation, Sam. I know you and some of the other leaders are working on like a blog and other content regarding this topic. So when those contents are available, we'll include the links to those resources on the podcast description. So be on the lookout for those. It'll probably come out in the I mean, this episode will probably get published like late July in 2024, but shortly afterwards, hopefully we'll see some more contents on our blog section of our website. So, Sam, anything else you want to add here, or I mean, I appreciate you coming back on and talking about refreshing the audience about what scalability and what some of the important considerations are for databases. But,
Nothing to add, maybe just to
yeah,
wrap it up. I mean,
yeah,
just the takeaway I think should be if you're going to scale along some dimension, consider how everything you do might change. Basically, that's it. That's the
right,
most simple action item that you can take away from this, and that
yeah,
requires some thought, like what it is that we do today, and then
right,
literally list everything, because that little thing that you do that you might not think is a
mm,
problem may become a problem. So
right.
consider it.
Right. Yeah, and then like you said, if people are evaluating different systems for purchase, I think you made this point. Ask those questions to whether it's a pre-sales teams or if you're talking to the engineering team, right? And then uh, because you're not going to be able to sort of figure all that out on your own. Like even if somebody has a great documentation, sometimes it's not always easy to find the information and uh, getting those questions answered is probably pretty important if you're making a large purchase. So
Yeah, and challenge those
cool.
people. If they tell you something that you think sounds crazy, maybe it is. So,
Right.
dig
Right.
in.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So cool. So the final question: when we talked to you last time, you were living in Northern California, in the East Bay to be exact. So you told us a trivia about uh, of your favorite pizza place in Berkeley, for example. That's one of the items you remember. Now, I think it's been well over like a 6 7 months. So you made a move down to the southern part of the state near LA. So tell us about where you live now and what you want to share about the area that you live in these days. So
I expected this question, and I thought to
yeah,
myself, like, what do I know about LA? I've been here
yeah,
for so little time, and I've been traveling
yeah,
a lot, and we took so much time
right,
moving in.
yeah,
And I I thought about like, oh, maybe I should just Google like trivia about LA, but I think that's
yeah,
cheating. So I think what
yeah,
instead I just kind of racked my brain for something that I learned while I
yeah,
was here that
yeah,
seemed like I should have known it. But
yeah,
there's a place here that it's unique in a way that without fail, every single person who lives and has ever lived in LA knows this name. But no one I've ever talked to who's never lived in LA knows this name. So by having both absolute fame in LA and no fame anywhere else, it's kind of a unique
yeah,
place like that, I think. And people who are listening may know this, so I
yeah,
apologize if I'm saying this incorrectly. But
yeah.
the the restaurant, or it's a bakery, basically a Cuban bakery called Porto's, and
Oh,
it's now a chain in LA, but it started as this small mom and pop Cuban bakery and dessert place that also sells like Cuban style kind of sandwiches and subs and paninis and stuff like that. And it is I think it's kind of like Costco in the sense that the food prices haven't changed for the last like, decades, a few decades.
yeah,
And so if people go in there, it's fantastic stuff. Um, and it's very, very cheap, very cheap, like beautiful desserts and beautiful pastries for like 250, whereas like at the equivalent at any other place would be like 750 to $10.
right,
And I think it's really interesting because this family created a business, and they did it so intelligently they were good at what they did, but then they also scaled it. I think it's so weird that this is the topic, but and I just thought of that, I promise.
Yeah.
They scaled it where the actual dollars they get per item haven't changed, but the scale, the sheer volume of the sales that they do,
Right.
every single store from open to close is backed up. They're constantly
Wow.
selling. And so the sheer volume just multiplies their margin, and they're just doing an incredible, like they're rich now. It's amazing. And this place is really
Wow.
cool. So I highly recommend, if you visit LA, hit a Porto's up.
Wow. I've never heard of it. I think I've been there, many times. But yeah, you're right. I've never heard of it. I'm actually going to Google it as
Yeah, it
soon as
seems
we're
like
done here.
it's a secret
Yeah.
only for people who have residency here for some reason. I don't know
All right.
why.
Cool.
Yeah,
Maybe
it
you need
sounds
to live
good.
there for more than a month or something. Then cool. I'll definitely check it out. So, well, thank you, Sam. I mean, thanks for coming back on, and yeah, good luck with the blog post. I know it's a lot of work, especially if you're traveling a lot, like you're doing writing work on the side. Like, adds more to your workload. But we look forward to it, and we'll make sure that we include a link to that article or blog post when it's published in the podcast description. And yeah, look forward to having you back on if you don't mind. So,
Can do, will do.
yeah,
Thanks. Thanks for
cool.
having me, guys.
All right, awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.